Where'd you grow up? How did you get to Silicon Valley?
So I grew up mostly in the UK. I moved there when I was 9. I studied computer science at Cambridge. I worked. I graduated in 2006, 2005, and then the first job I did was at Bloomberg. So I worked there for a year, and then I decided I didn't like the whole kind of job thing, and I would like do startups instead. So since 2006, I've done a sequence of startups, and Mercury is my fourth company.
You mentioned, working for a company was too boring. Coming out of Cambridge, I think you started working at Bloomberg. How was that? What did it take to decide that that wasn't for you?
I've always thought eventually I would do a company. I've always been. My dad is an entrepreneur. He owns a kind of mechanic car workshop thing in Pakistan. So I always thought I'd do it. And then in 2006 there was like this whole tech crunch thing. So everyone was talking about tech startups a little bit. Obviously, it's way crazier now, but it was just kind of starting up, and everything that came on there like looked kind of easy, right? Like this was the days of like social things and like web things, and like if you've done computer science and you can make some websites, like that stuff seemed pretty easy, right? Obviously, now I know it takes way more than just like building something, but from like a somewhat like naive perspective, it was like, okay, these people are doing these things, they're like raising lots of money, and it sounds like kind of an interesting thing to do. So that kind of got me interested in it. And I've always kind of been a believer in kind of this thing I call like asymmetric like upside, which is that, life has this like potential downside when you take risks, like you don't have your salary or whatever, but when you do things that have like potentially like a large upside with whether like money or opportunity or whatever, it's kind of worth doing. So I kind of viewed that basically like even at the start in 2006 when I was like, okay, I'm going to give up this job at Bloomberg, which is a nice job and I get paid well, but I'm pretty sure I can get a job, either the same job or a job like it if I want to afterwards. So I was only like, in my opinion, forsaking like some, a year of salary to try it out. And potentially like the upside was much bigger. And, and that's pretty much how it played out. So I started that company, and, it didn't work out and we didn't even raise any money. But within 7 months, I kind of decided that this was going to be something I do. And then I moved to San Francisco and did a Y Combinator company in 2007.
Can you tell us a bit more about those first two startups? What went well? What didn't go well? What did you learn?
Well, almost everything went badly, but but kind of incrementally better. So my first startup, it was like a Yelp for London. It was super early on, right? We're talking about 2006. It was just me and my friend from Bloomberg. We quit our jobs. We made this thing. It took like 4 months to build it. We kind of pivoted. We had like this real estate idea that kind of turned into this. And we put it out there. No one really wanted to use it. We didn't really have a way of like knowing how to get people to use it. He wanted to go get married and like get a normal job. So that's basically like the arc of that journey. It was fairly short. But I met a lot of other entrepreneurs in London, and I kind of got hooked to the idea of doing this. And at the time, like the London scene was like not. I mean, there were startups, but they were like countable, like maybe 10 or something. Whereas obviously, Silicon Valley has like uncountable number of startups now. But even then, there was a lot more action here. So I decided to move here, and we knew a few people who'd done Y Combinator before. And obviously, when you're thinking about kind of moving from one country to another, it can be kind of like a tricky thing to contemplate. But Y Combinator gives you this like relatively easy access because they give you some money and they help you with like lawyers and all this stuff to figure out how to actually move. So in my second company, I kind of got together with two people from London. We did a Y Combinator company. It was called ClickPass. That one things progressed a lot further than my first startup. We raised $300,000 or so, and we moved to San Francisco. We ran that thing. It was basically you probably remember Gabor. It was called ClickPass. It was a single sign-on mechanism, made it easy to log into websites. We actually did pretty well. We got, I think, about 3 million users altogether. and the idea was like, this is before like Facebook login and like Google Suite login or whatever it's called was a big deal, and we kind of enabled all of that and made it really easy for websites and developers to integrate that. So we got a lot of users, but we never had any sort of monetization attached to it, and it was just kind of hard to raise more money at the end of that. We did it for like a year and a half, but it was like, okay, now we need to raise more money, and there wasn't really a good story on how we would monetize it. In hindsight, I think I could have made a much better story. But so in the end, we ended up going the talent acquisition route, and we talked to a lot of companies around, basically getting a glorified kind of hire. And I decided I was kind of still having too much fun doing startups. So then I started my third company, which is called HeyZap.
How did 2007, 2008 feel the same or different maybe as 2019 and 2020, as we're kind of in a similar probably economic arc? But I think the whole startup ecosystem was just at a different point back then.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, it's not like it was easy to get funding in 2007, right? Like at the start of 2007, before that crisis, it was still a really painful process. There was much fewer companies did it. You had to be reasonably far along. What happened at the end of 2008 is like basically it just stopped. Well, end of 2008, beginning of 2009, there was just, at least from my perspective, very few people were getting funded for like, but it was a relatively short time. I would say about 9 months. No one knew what was happening. No one was getting funded. I think this time it's slightly different. There's just way more funding sources out there. And they have all raised like way more money. So I do think there's been a contraction in valuations, but I think like if you have an interesting startup, you can still get funded on the whole. Maybe not like specifically like between March 15th and like towards the end of April. I think things were pretty bad then. But I'm seeing like a reasonable amount of like action now. It's hard to tell like how this plays out for the next kind of 12 months, right? Like VC ecosystem for some reason is, I have some thesis on it, but in many ways it's tied to the public market, and the public market only had like a relatively short-term downturn. So now that everything looks optimistic in the public market, even if the economy is doing badly, the private market is mostly doing better. At least it's liquid, even if valuations are like slightly compressed. I mean, on the other side, the tide did pull back. So like everyone who was out there swimming naked, as it was, did, whether it's, SoftBank companies or whatever, like there was a lot of people out there that just needed like continuous kind of fresh sources of capital and didn't have like a great kind of high margin business. Those have definitely suffered, but, it was somewhat inevitable that at some point, like, there would be a reckoning for those. But generally speaking, like software businesses that are like, profitable, or any business that's like doing well is doing fine. And I think seed stage companies are still getting funded.
So let's go back to HeyZap, the third company, which I think you started in 2007 or 2008? End of 2008. Can you tell us about that company? What was the idea? How did it go? What were the learnings?
Yeah, so that company was a real marathon. We went from end of 2008, and then we sold it in January 2016. So 8 years, 8 years, something like that. And we started in like Flash gaming. So back in 2008, Flash gaming was still like the main way casual games happened. And we wanted to, we had a few iterations around Flash gaming, but basically around like making it easy to access Flash games and like different.
You might have to explain what Flash is.
Forget it. I'm not going to do it. you can use Wikipedia on that one.
Flash was a web technology to have little animated interactive widgets on your website.
Come on. But anyway, so Flash was clearly dying, and as it is dead now. But it was still like the main thing that the casual games happened on, and then mobile launched, right? Mobile gaming as a platform didn't really become a thing until like towards the end of 2009, and then by 2010 it was just pretty obvious that like all of the all of the air in the Flash ecosystem and any other kind of casual gaming ecosystem was like sucked out and gone into mobile. So it was obvious we needed to do something there, but everything we'd built so far was like pretty useless in mobile. Just didn't, mobile was owned by the app stores. It didn't make sense to have like a distribution play there as like an independent kind of player. So we ended up basically, we'd actually been like relatively successful in that first bit of like distributing Flash games. So we'd raised a Series A, which back then a Series A was $3 million, which now like the Mercury Series A was $20 million. But so we recently actually raised that. So we still had a lot of kind of in the bank, but we were pretty sold on like Flash gaming not working. So instead of returning the money or anything like that, we decided we would pivot and we would make a mobile gaming social network. So the idea was you would say what games you play, you would make friends around those games, you'd have discussions around them, that kind of thing. And that was gonna, when I pivot 2 or so of that company around 2011. And that was actually, again, we did fairly well in terms of getting distribution. We partnered with a lot of games. We had about 10 million installs. But we always had a hard time kind of retaining these users. Like there wasn't a good reason for people to keep coming back. And we never made a retention's always kind of tricky when you have fueled the growth, not by word of mouth, I think, like when you fueled it by kind of partnerships and things like that. So eventually we tried a lot of things. We spent about 2 years kind of, we had this kind of top of funnel figured out. We spent about 2 years of doing different things, trying to get retention better. We ended up doing like leaderboard inside games and all sorts of like things. And I think every 6 months or so we did like some experiment, just couldn't figure it out. And then eventually we were running, getting close to running out of money. And we started doing experiments around advertising, and we showed inside our mobile social network, we showed some ads for this kind of Japanese game developer. I'm trying to remember their name. It starts with D. It's not Gree, but it's the other Japanese game. But anyway, the Japanese game developers were trying to get like a lot of mobile app installs back then, and we were really big on Android, that social network. So like it was crazy. They just gave us $60,000, no tracking, nothing. They were like, "Go get us installs," and we were like, "Oh, this is kind of cool." Like someone just gave us $60,000. It was the first, like 6 years into this company, 5 years into this company, it was the first kind of money someone gave us. So then we kind of pivoted again, and we actually became an ad network for mobile games. So we were pretty much the first kind of Android specific ad network that did like interstitials and like those kind of video ads and things like that. And that was very successful, but the ad network game is like absolutely brutal. So we were profitable, but we were already, within 6 months. So we went from like, almost dying to like 6 months in, we were a profitable company doing that. But like, even while we got there, we knew that we had to do something else to be like actual, A, it's not something we were excited by. B, I think it's just very hard to like build a sustainable long-term company as an ad network. A few people pull it off, mostly around like when new platforms launch, like AdMob did it and Google bought it or whatever. But it's very hard to do it like after a platform is like kind of already sustained. And you actually built an ad network, so you know all about this. And then we did our final pivot. This is kind of, I guess, like end of 2014, where we did something called mobile mediation. So mediation is a developer tool to help app developers maximize how much money they make on ad tech. And this was just after there's this company called Burstly that was acquired by Apple and then shut down. And there was another company called Mopub that was acquired by Twitter and kind of not really looked after. So there was kind of this like gap in this market, and we were in a unique position to kind of understand the gap and already have like a lot of the technology pieces to do it. And that was our final kind of pivot, and that was actually very successful. We had, I think, 3 or 4 of the top games on iOS and Android at any one point in like 2015 were using Haze app to kind of do all their mobile mediation. And we had an acquisition offer by our main competitor, which we ended up taking, and we sold it in 2016.
And so just imagining those board meetings with your venture capitalist investors, you just came in every 6 months and they were rolling their eyes that Immad and Jude have yet another idea or yet another crazy spin on what they were doing?
Yeah, I think like towards the end of it, they were a little checked out, I guess. But I mean, they were not checked out. Like they were, we were always progressing, right? Like there was always a plan, and like I think, we have this like nature that we're always planning things. So from their perspective, they're like, okay, cool, these guys just won't give up. So I don't think they minded per se, right? Like we were always trying to like get better, and we were really trying. So yeah, I think venture capitalists sometimes get like a bad rap, but like at the end of the day, they're like fairly empathetic people. They're like mostly on your side. So I think they could like understand that like, there were some circumstances and we were like doing the right thing on the whole. And, like especially these kind of early stage VCs, 30% of the companies fail outright. And then, 30% of them don't really return much more than the money they give them. So, these are the ratios that they're already living with. So, at the end, like they stuck by us, and we actually gave them a multiple on their money. So I think they were pretty happy about it.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about what came after HeyZap. So you were acquired, and then you went back to YC for a while, if I recall the sequence of events correctly.
So this is 2016. I started investing a lot. I wanted to see if I wanted to be kind of an investor full time. So I think 2016, I invested in like 30 companies or so. And then the half of 2016, I also joined YC as a part-time partner. This is while I was still doing my earn-out at the company that had acquired us. And I did those things kind of in parallel. And then, after 1 year when my earn-out was finished, I kind of left that company and was basically, continuing to invest and continuing to think about. I was still YC part-time partner. And at that point, I kind of also started digging into, Mercury and what I wanted to do next. And, the call of being an entrepreneur kind of came back to bite me. And I started kind of fairly quickly after, I got some free time. I went pretty deep into kind of starting Mercury and figuring out how to do that.
So let's talk about Mercury. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is and how you came up with the idea?
So Mercury is banking for startups. There's 3 buckets of things we do. Number 1, we give you kind of the financial tools that you need to, from a bank as a startup. So checking account, savings account, debit cards, that kind of things. Number 2, we have tools to really like help you kind of as a startup get the best out of your bank. So we have an API. We give you virtual cards. We have user permissions. All that kind of things. And then 3, as a kind of like as a broader philosophy, we try to build products like in this kind of modern way that you would expect from any other service, but like banks haven't done. We have really good customer service that responds to you like online as chat or email or whatever. And then we have a lot of transparency around our pricing to make it kind of a no-brainer, like we don't have any fees or anything like that. And we do what's best for the customers around that. And the idea for Mercury I've had actually since about 2013. So it was always hard to get a good service from the banks we used at my previous companies. Between 2006 and onwards, all of these services that businesses used have improved, right? There's kind of an overall trend of like consumerization of business tools. So back in 2006, like everything sucked, right? Like there wasn't any, like payroll sucked, communication tools sucked. It was just not enjoyable. You didn't get the consumer grade kind of enjoyable experiences. But those things improved over time. But banking didn't improve at all, and even until Mercury launched, it hadn't really improved. You would still be using the same kind of clunky bank. You'd have to go in person to sign up, or you'd have to have like some like PDF thing where you have to fill it out. It was just like a very clunky kind of initial experience, and then everything after that was kind of painful. And I just think like, I'm from the UK, so it helped because I always saw these, for whatever reason, banking is kind of ahead of the curve in Europe. So there was a lot of kind of challenger banks, even in 2017, that were doing pretty well. Monzo and 26 on the consumer side, and then Tide and Quanto and a few other ones on the business side. So I felt it was somewhat inevitable that those same trends would happen in the US. Like there's not, the US banking system is like 10 times bigger than any European country, or maybe even 20 times bigger than any European country. So it's like, it's a huge market opportunity, and with like really bad software and really bad kind of companies that are not like modern. So all those trends existed. I had obviously felt the pain point. And yeah, when 2017 came, no one had solved the problem yet. I just thought I'd do it myself.
So Mercury being your fourth startup, I imagine that the fundraise for that was a little bit easier than for the previous ones. So you just walk into Andreessen Horowitz and they wrote you a multi-million-dollar check. Is that the right sort of model to think about?
It was definitely easier. It's never, no one's just going to give you multi-million dollars without like you doing all your homework, right? So I think the biggest thing that helped is I'd been an investor for a while by that point. So I think I had a lot of like empathy for both how to have a conversation with investors by then, and also like what are the things they look for. So by the time the fundraising happened, I put in a lot of like homework to like make sure it was successful. So I'd like de-risk the startup as much as I could. So we had like designs we'd made for like what the website would look like. I had term sheets from like partner banks to like have a framework for like what the actual like backend would look like, and I'd spend a lot of time kind of thinking through like what's the business model, what's the market, what all of these kind of things. And the person who eventually led the round, Alex Rampell, I had met him like twice during that year, just mostly because he's a very knowledgeable person. He worked at Visa. He's a co-founder of a firm and Point. So, but also partly like you kind of have to sow these seeds for like a longer term before you actually need the money. So I'd done all of this kind of like back prep work or whatever. And then by the time I needed to raise money, one of the tricky things in fintech, even now, but especially back then, is you just need to raise. Like your worst case scenario with like launching a bank is that it's going to take you 2 years to launch it, and then it'll take you another year of like iteration and all of that before you're in a situation where you could like raise more money, right? So I kind of needed to prepare for like potentially like 3 years before I have enough results that I can raise more money. And then on top of that, you have to do a bank deal, and then you kind of have to hire more people because it's not just a software thing where you just build it and you kind of need to do all of this back-end integration work, and there's a bunch of steps involved there. So either way, I kind of pre-decided that like I needed to raise $5 million. And that was kind of my mindset going into the seed round. And I initially started with talking to people that I already had a good relationship with, that I'd co-invested with previously, or they'd invested in my previous company. So quite quickly, within half a week or so, maybe a week, I had like $1 million committed from those people. And then I just happened to talk to Andreessen Horowitz. I actually didn't expect them to lead the round, just because it's really pre-seed kind of, right? Like there's not that much to show for it, and like VCs are kind of often tricky. But they were Alex was intrigued, and within that was a Thursday, and then he brought me into a partners meeting on Tuesday, and they gave me a term sheet on the same day.
So one last question about Mercury, which I've been personally wondering about. I've seen a lot of outdoor advertising for Mercury in San Francisco, bus stops, etc. Does that actually work? I thought digital was all the rage.
Actually, that's a good question. One of the tricky things with Mercury, and that's something we're always working towards, is like building trust, right? I think we're asking people to like put a lot of money into a bank account from a startup, right? There's that's always like a tricky kind of barrier to cross with people. And our thesis when we did outdoor advertising, it wasn't necessarily purely like performance based, right? We weren't expecting to like drive a bunch of users through it, although that would be nice. Our thesis was mostly around, hey, if we do that, and that's something like a more mature company does, we're instilling kind of our brand in people's minds. And it's not just for us, it's not just about the entrepreneurs, it's also about investors that invest in them and the ecosystem, so that like a bank account isn't something you decide to have all the time, right? Like it's not like something you can switch easily, But when you do think about like, I'm starting a new company, what's the bank I should use, or you just get really frustrated because your existing bank like charges you a fee or like breaks in some way, fundamental way, then you're like, oh, I should just like do Mercury. You know, I saw their ad like 6 months ago. So it was more like a long-term kind of brand planning rather than like purely performance-based. Whether it drove performance or not, I think it did a little bit, but we only ran it in like San Francisco. So it was a very localized short-term effect. Yeah, I have some like anecdotal data on it, but like real data is very hard to do with like outdoor advertising.
With that, I want to, as I said, switch gears a little bit and talk a bit more about advice for founders, and I think especially advice for first-time founders, because you've mentored a lot at Y Combinator. Let me maybe just ask the very general question: what is the most common piece of advice that you give really early stage kind of first-time founders?
I think there's like a lot of kind of early traps to fall into. So I mean, I try to avoid generic advice, to be honest. But you know, I try to understand people's situations. I think, but yeah, I think people often get scared of launching and like don't want to get out there, right? Like that's always a risk. Like they want to over perfect the product, they don't get customer feedback. I think that's always dangerous. So that's like one piece of advice that does come up. I think sometimes people, especially in Silicon Valley, get a little too focused on fundraising as a goal, right? Sometimes obviously you do need to fundraise, but the goal is really to like make a successful business. And like I think focusing too much on like what are the metrics that investors are looking for, like, you know, how do I make this pitch all about investors? Like I don't think that's like what it's about, right? Like I mean, those are nice things to like think about in the background, but you really want to be focused on like delivering a good product and like doing something for customers. I think, you know, one thing that I think it's interesting, but people often miss especially when they're early, is like startups are all about growth, right? So actually, like sometimes you can like, and this bit's going to contradict my previous statement a little bit, but sometimes there's ways of making revenue upfront, right? Like you could do consulting, you could do other things that are kind of like these short-term boosts, and you could like make 50K or whatever. Like those things are like heavily discounted in general in your enterprise value, but especially in kind of like when it talks about like startups, because you really want to build things that have like recurring revenue where like you're basically like compounding this effort, right? Like the whole thing is like, you know, how did like someone like Google or whatever like start from like basically zero and get to like $1 billion in revenue? I think from Google's probably 30 billion in revenue or something. And the only way that happens is like with this continuous kind of compounding of like revenue. And the only way that happens is through thinking about growth all the time and thinking about like this kind of sustainable growth kind of vectors, whether it's like distribution channel, whether it's like product decisions you make that like lead to this kind of sustainable growth. So I think like that's kind of an interesting one. Like, and it, you know, when you think about everything and every decision from like a growth perspective, it helps you kind of decide, like prioritize like what makes sense, like what types of customers are useful here, all of that kind of stuff.
Think about the Immad that had just quit his job at Bloomberg in London. What advice would you give him?
You know, one thing I think I massively underestimated, and that did, I don't know, it cost me, but it probably could have saved me if I understood it better, is that there's this like general advice of like ideas don't matter, right? And I think I was like a little bit too much into that advice back then. So, you know, we would brainstorm ideas, we would execute whatever, but it wasn't things that I was like truly passionate about. And there weren't things that were necessarily like these kind of big markets necessarily. They were like, I mean, they were good like paper ideas often, right? But they weren't something that like truly was like a revolutionary market that like we could dominate and all of that kind of stuff. So I think that's something it's a hard balance, because it comes back, like there's a lot of people who are always looking for this perfect idea, and like actually just experiencing failure and doing things is by itself a lesson. And, you know, potentially you need to go through some of that lesson to get better ideas. But I definitely feel like I spent way too much time, like first, second, and third startup, basically like just jumping between ideas rather than like really spending a little bit more time doing a little bit more research, but also like being a little bit more like, personally attached to like solving this kind of huge problem, which is where we eventually got to Mercury, but I didn't do Mercury until like 11 years into like doing startups. So that's how long it took me to really do something that I found like meaningful and was in a big market.
So for folks that are kind of thinking about starting their startup, what advice do you have to getting into Y Combinator?
Yeah, I think getting into YC is not that different from like just getting any investor or just being successful in general, right? Like, I think the further along you are, the better it is. Whether it's like, or like, more broadly, like the more you've de-risked your startup, the better it is, right? Like whether it's like you've launched something, you have actual revenue, you have customers lined up. I think that whole thing is useful and valuable. Let's see. I mean, in general, they prefer like non-solo founders. So ideally, you put together a team, and putting together a good team where you have domain expertise and you have like a complementary skill set and you can execute it. I think that's like a valuable thing to do in general, but obviously particularly useful in terms of getting into YC. Let's see. I think people actually like overthink some of these things a little bit. Like I think a lot of it, at least when it comes to like interviewing and stuff, is like you kind of just have to be yourself and be natural and like not and be authentic and not try to like be too rehearsed or like have like some sick plan or like all of these things. Like you just have to kind of genuinely kind of have something interesting and be interested in it. Actually, one thing that I do think is like valuable for YC and any investor is like actually a lot of it does come down to like how enthusiastic you are. Like there's this like soft aspect to like all of these decisions, which is like, do they like you? Are you enthusiastic? Does it seem like you really care about this idea? Like those types of things are like, somewhat like obvious, but also like I think they're underestimated, especially by like engineering type people.
All right, Immad, thank you for answering these questions and thank you for your time.